Great. Welcome to our dialogues on how to build a culture of empathy. I'm Edwin Rutsch, and today I'm here with Pauline Tesler. Thanks for joining me for this discussion.
I'm delighted to talk with you.
So let me give a little introduction. You're, as I understand it, a certified family law specialist, and you're the founding director of the Integrative Law Institute at Commonweal. And the Commonweal does workshops, seminars, trainings, retreats, and leads certification programs in integrative law.
Commonweal doesn't, no.
Oh, no.
The Integrative Law Institute does that.
Okay. Well, maybe you can tell us something more about it. What is the Commonweal? What is the Integrative Law Institute? And kind of introduce that.
Sure. The Integrative Law Institute is a nonprofit program that I started around 2012 that grew out of the work that I'd done in movement building in the world of collaborative practice, which we can talk about in a minute. And I was looking for an institutional home for the nonprofit and found Commonweal just up the road from where I live in West Marin County. Commonweal has its home base in Bolinas, which is one of the tiniest little outposts in the bay, way out in West Marin. But it has a worldwide reach. It consists of maybe 15, depending on how you count, different programs, none of which are directed from above by anybody. They're all programs that were created by people like me who have a passion to do the work we're doing, whether in health or social justice or environmental policy and justice. And the particular programs change from time to time as the people who get drawn into the Commonweal community change. But it was founded by a brilliant man named Michael Lerner, who was one of the early MacArthur Award winners. And he's just made it his life work to draw change agents into an environment where their work can be supported. So that's Commonweal. Mm-hmm. And the Integrative Law Institute is the work that I do. It's my passion and my purpose is, our little tagline is to reclaim law as a healing profession. And pretty much that's what I've been aiming to do for most of my work as a lawyer.
How'd you get started with that? With creating the institute and kind of going in that direction?
Well, the way it started was that I went to law school in order to do social change, and I did my first legal work in a legal services backup and support center that was called the National Center for Youth Law. And we did test case litigation on behalf of impoverished children and families, going all the way up to the California and US Supreme Courts to change laws and policies that were standing in the way of the welfare of people. When Reagan got elected president, one of his priorities was to make sure that no money ever went from the government to programs like that ever again. And he did a pretty good job of that. So I went into private practice at that point, into family law. And I had been a very effective litigator on behalf of poor children. And in my naivete, I thought that those skills would work pretty well in the world of family law. And boy, was I ever wrong, but it took me a while to figure out what was wrong with the picture. I was very effective at the work I was doing, but my clients who won looked pretty much the same as my clients who lost, because terrible things happen to families that come in contact with our legal system. It was never meant if you were going to design a structure to help families going through normal transitions when relationships change, our court system would be just about the last thing that you would want to design. One of the family law judges that I did admire said that family court is where they shoot the survivors, and that's not much of an exaggeration. So I became more and more frustrated and discouraged about the work I was doing. But I didn't see any other way that I could use the skills that I had. And then I started studying with a transpersonal anthropologist named Angie Arian, who opened my eyes to what should have been obvious, but it never struck me, that other cultures handle conflict differently, and that it's not necessary to have a binary oppositional system where there's a winner and a loser in every dispute. And I got very excited about that. And in the course of that work, I discovered a guy in Minnesota named Stuart Webb, a family lawyer, who had had an inspiration. You might call it unilateral disarmament. He was the sort of person that any lawyer would like to have representing the other party, a very humane and caring guy. And he said, I'm not going to go to court anymore. And if anybody wants to take a matter to court that I'm a lawyer on, I'm going to bow out. And out of that grew what is now a movement in 28 or so countries called variously collaborative law or collaborative practice. And because it was one of those lucky moments where my path intersected with a movement that needed to happen. And I became one of the pioneers in that movement. I did a lot of teaching internationally and writing, and helped to create the umbrella organization for that movement, which is called the International Academy of Collaborative Professionals. We do interdisciplinary team conflict resolution in the domain of family law, with mental health professionals and lawyers and financial neutrals working together in teams to help families address the predictable kinds of issues that every family has. And in the course of that work, what happened is that for the first time, lawyers were signing contracts with their clients that said that nobody would go to court during the course of the work. And if they wanted to go to court, which they always could, that all of the professionals would have to bow out and they would have to go find adversarial, aggressive litigators. The motivation for everybody at the table to work harder when things get difficult was really astonishing. Nobody had anticipated that, but of course nobody wants to fail. And when you're in court, failing means losing. But when you're at a collaborative problem-solving table, failure means not being able to figure out what to do next. And there's a lot of intentionality and brain power around that table. And we do figure out another way to come at it. And when lawyers with that intentionality began working with mental health professionals, we started getting a master class in how to do it differently. So that was the genesis of the Integrative Law Institute, because what I realized is that the key to having a different approach to human conflict resolution is for lawyers to transform how they understand their work and how they understand themselves as part of a human system to help others. Family lawyers are fertile ground for making those changes, because we see what happens to people when bad professional services are provided. Sorry, my dog is helping me out. If she keeps it up, I'll do something.
Okay, sure.
But the rest of the legal profession is not, hold on, I'm going to close the doors. We don't have quite so much. There. There are a lot of disputes and conflicts that are basically human relationships in trouble that are not family law matters. And the lawyers who do those kinds of practices don't really understand the harm that they're doing for the most part. I run into very few stereotypical greedy, nasty lawyers. Mostly they're well-intentioned people who have been taught to do a job in a way that doesn't meet the needs of the people we're intended to help. The culture assigns that job to us, but the legal institutions don't serve people well, and law school education doesn't teach us how to do what's needed. So the Integrative Law Institute is my effort to take what we've discovered doing interdisciplinary team collaboration and bring it to lawyers who have no idea that what they're doing is hurting people. That was a long answer.
Yeah, no, that was excellent. That's very clear. Thank you for that. So that fits in with, what I'm looking at is sort of a cultural shift to place empathy as a core, primary core cultural value. I've seen that, like you're talking about, the justice system is based on that competition, sort of a battle. It's, you hire these lawyers, they're the gladiators who, do the battle for you in a sense. And, one will win, one will lose, and there'll be this external judgment, saying who is right and wrong. And then there's that punishment and retribution, component to it too, versus and what I would say a culture of empathy, where it's more about restoring connection. Like there's some kind of, in a conflict, there's a disconnection happening. We're trying to restore that connection. There's a lot of different practices for that, restorative justice, restorative practice. But even sort of upstream to that, it seems that we need a lot of support for the cultural change to keep those conflicts from happening in the first place. There's a real shortage of relationship building and nurturing practices in the culture. And there's sort of not that cultural mind shift, that mindset to sort of value empathy, from the get-go. So I see what you're doing is very much a piece of that, to build a more empathic culture and society.
Absolutely, and I suppose that from that perspective, you could see a continuum where ideally parents of children and kindergartens and preschools would be teaching conflict resolution as a basic human skill, just like communication as a part of communication and a part of self-awareness. That isn't happening at the moment, for sure.
Yeah.
And there are some entrenched interests, I suppose you could say, that don't want to see human development that way. There are still some, I guess we're discovering some large sectors of our country that are intentionally very patriarchal and authoritarian and like it that way, and are fearful of these kinds of changes. But that's the work that we're all here to be doing. And the other end of that continuum is what happens when people have conflicts that are entirely beyond their capacity to resolve. People in that situation can still have very honorable intentions. This was the big discovery for me as I moved toward collaborative practice, is that although the culture encourages people, when they get to that point of a conflict that's beyond them, encourages them, I hate this term, but it shows the cultural meme, they're encouraged to lawyer up, and they see on television what that means, and they often will come into a lawyer's office thinking that what they're supposed to do is express angry, aggressive, vengeful intentions. And this really is part of the work that I've taken on, is to help lawyers understand that in the first instance, it's an educational process that we need to be doing, because we are the conflict resolution professionals. And when people come into a lawyer's office, they expect that they're going to hire a gladiator, and we don't have to accept that invitation. The real job is to help people understand where that road leads, and that there are other roads that are much more constructive. Some people are able to hear that the entire human system and the community and the culture will benefit from that. Other people are only able to hear in those moments that they will benefit, but the truth is they will benefit. And if the lawyers aren't telling them that, then wars happen that nobody actually wants and that hurt everybody, including the professionals, including the clients, everyone who comes in contact with that zero-sum, angry, fighting-based system is diminished in terms of their human capacities to enjoy a full life when they go through that.
Yeah, so it's really, it sounds like you're trying to really get the lawyers to change so their mindset, so when the clients are coming, they're already in this great distress and conflict, and they probably don't have a lot of capacity for, thinking beyond that, and thinking of the larger social issues. So if you can have the lawyers be sort of attuned to, how to deal with these conflicts in a more empathic, restorative way, then it sounds like that's kind of where you're.
That's where I've positioned the work that I'm doing. Other people in the integrative law movement are doing their work with individual lawyers who have, you might say, crashed and burned as a result of doing that work. The vicarious trauma can be substantial. Yeah. And those lawyers are desperately seeking another way. And people like Kim Wright tend to work with those people who are wide open to new possibilities. I've chosen to work with the tougher nuts, the ones who don't see themselves as part of the problem, don't see themselves as creating the conditions for making conflict worse, and who don't see the toll that it takes on themselves and their own families. So those people don't go to workshops that have the word collaborative in them or the word empathy in them. They run the other way. And that's what I've always been drawn to, is how can people who really have no clue of the harm they're doing to themselves and others, but who wouldn't want to do it if they knew, how can I offer experiences that they will want to sign up for and even pay money to come to, that will have that kind of transformative impact on them, even though that's not what they thought they were signing up for. Mm-hmm. So that's the work that I'm doing. And what I know, because I come from a family of lawyers, I think my first and second degree relatives, there are 15 or 16 lawyers. Wow. I love lawyers. I love the legal profession. But that's not how we're supposed to be doing it. We're supposed to be healing breaches in the social fabric. So what I know about my colleagues in the legal profession is that if you think in triune brain terms, they are aware of their thinking cognitive brains, which are very highly developed instruments, but they're quite unaware of the degree to which their evolutionary endowment is so much greater than that there's a limbic brain and a reptilian brain, and that we are embodied emotional creatures who need connection. They don't know about that stuff. And once they start understanding it cognitively, you have to approach my buddies in the profession. You have to approach them through their thinking brains, because that's the only way they'll show up. But once they start understanding intellectually what it means to be a human being, you can give them experiences, the kind, I'm talking about workshop experiences, but they can be profound. And I've had guys in three-piece suits with tears running down their faces at the end of 1 or 2 days of that kind of immersion in how human conflict actually operates within our organism, and what a human system is like that is invoked to try to address conflict, and how obvious it is the ways that law school training makes it worse, and how accessible additional tools are that can allow us to do profoundly richer work with our clients, that's an irresistible invitation, but you got to get them in the door.
Yeah, there's a lot of more meaning involved in that, and kind of more integrated self. Well, this is like part, you were talking about the legal profession. This is part of the larger culture, right? There's sort of like a cultural shift that needs to be happening. You're talking about patriarchy and people that you're seeing that maybe don't support this. And so it fits in with the political, the political dynamics. And that's where, we've been working with our empathy tent. We go to these political rallies where the political right comes to, like Berkeley, and then the political left, the more extreme left, come and they battle it out. So we have some, it's just a manifestation of the cultural battle that's sort of happening. And we go there, we set up this empathy tent, and we listen to both sides. So we invite one side, then we invite the other. And we've done it. We were at a impeach Trump rally in Los Angeles, and there was a counter pro-Trump rally. And we had a person from each side come into the empathy tent, and we did a mediation with them.
Really? And they showed up for that?
They showed up. There was a filmmaker. She was making a documentary about this, and maybe it's Los Angeles because there was a 3-camera shoot, like right in the Los Angeles city or the council or center, right there right downtown on their lawn. Across the street was the police station where the pro-Trump side was, and then it was several thousand anti-Trump protesters came marching down. But we had all those cameras, and it's LA, so maybe think, there's cameras, we got to get on, we got to be filmed. So we did. I mediated like six pairs of people. So Trump, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, and we did active empathic listening. So I'd start modeling it, doing empathic listening with one, with the other, and then ask them to do empathic listening, active listening with each other. And and each of those ended with them hugging each other. I preloaded it. I gave each one a hug independently at the end, and they said, "Okay, we'll give the other person."
It wasn't exactly spontaneous, but they did it.
Yeah, exactly. And they all agreed to continue the conversation in an empathy circle online afterwards. So they, to have sort of follow up. They agreed to that. So it just shows that. This political divide is just like a family. I mean, we have a big family, basically, in the country. We're one big family, and it's sort of a dysfunctional family.
Yeah.
But, all the tools that you're talking about are the tools for bridging those cultural divides, too.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I'll look forward to seeing that film. That's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah. And we've done it in Berkeley and, other places, in Sacramento. In fact, in Sacramento, we had, there was a right-wing rally. So we've been invited to some of the, politically right-wing rallies. And we're there with the empathy tent. We're the only, sort of liberal types there. And we had, at one of them, we had 5 Identity Europa members. I don't know if you know them, but they were the ones that had the tiki torches and the khaki pants in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
And they came into the tent, and we were actually teaching them how to do empathic listening. And, they were, they struggled with it, some of them, but then they started getting it. So I think that is the solution. Instead of, name calling, just saying, you guys are terrible, you're full of hate, we got to shut you down. It's like, bring the different sides together and and teach empathic listening, empathic dialogue, and have it, facilitated dialogue. And it's the same thing you're doing, but it's like just in a different context. So it's
and there are increasing numbers of stories. I was just reading one in the New Yorker about a guy in England who was in a white supremacist group that was turning quite violent and had actually committed a murder. And that was the point at which his own humanity got triggered, and he became a double agent for the police But the New Yorker piece was about the opening of his heart, how it was that he was so drawn to that angry and violent worldview. And it wouldn't have taken a murder to reach a man like that if there had been resources aiming to do so. So it's what you're doing is quite remarkable.
There's a lot of stories of, how just listening to the different sides and kind of being present with them, how that, creates connection and transformation. There's a guy named Daryl Davies. He's African American, and he would go and talk with Ku Klux Klan members because he was just wondering, like, why do you hate me, or because I'm Black. I mean, you don't even know me. But he would go talk to him, and he actually befriended him. And he has in his closet, he has 20 KKK, the hoods and stuff of people who he connected with. And they said, hey, this, it transformed them. And they actually gave him their robes as sort of, oh, here, you can have my robe. And they kind of got out of it. And there's a whole documentary on his work called, I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, it's Daryl Davis. And there's, a lot of stories like that. And so I guess the question is how do we, there's throughout society, there's organizations and, movements like this based around empathy. It seems to me that it seems to me that we need to come together to make this larger cultural transformation. Like, how do we need some really deep cultural shift. And it seems to me that now's the time for doing it, if things are so heated and there's just all this, upset in the fabric of the society, that now might be a space and time to have, try to have a bigger cultural, political, social, shift towards a more empathic society.
I think that you're quite right, because it strikes me that that the traditional categories and alliances are breaking down, because the kinds of challenges that we're seeing and that we know are coming ahead are so unprecedented and enormous. And if ever it was necessary for our species to behave like a functional family, it would be now. So I mean, what you're doing is evidence that there's an openness to trying to figure out what can we do that will be better than this. And this is one of the big answers. For me, it's applying the tools in a specific context, but every context is experiencing the same kind of deafening noise instead of conversation. You yourself actually might want to contact the Commonweal director, because the programs that Commonweal runs are not physically located in Bolinas. It's a virtual community, with Commonweal providing the compliance and back office and legitimacy, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I am confident that Oren would be interested in talking to you.
Yeah, should do. I mean, this is kind of the center for building a culture of empathy right here. So it's good to be, don't have to do all that nonprofit, having a fiscal sponsor and all that kind of stuff. It kind of takes some of the work.
And I think if you were to tell him about your empathy tents, that he'd be fascinated about that. And fiscal sponsorship is pretty easy. It's also not that hard to actually become a program with the board providing governance. So there are all kinds of opportunities if you click, if you're on the same wavelength, and I expect you would be.
Yeah. Well, so how do we make that cultural shift? Like, I don't know if there's sort of that, you've got your area with just the lawyers, and what do you think about kind of that larger cultural shift? Is, for example, what I'm looking at is thinking of is if we could get the politicians to take part in empathy circles, where they actually, model empathic listening with each other. It's kind of like a really basic mediation, therapeutic listening sort of a practice, just active listening seems to me like a really good, like first, sort of a baby step that you can easily learn, practice, and it goes a long ways towards, sort of a mind shift. And if we could get politicians to have these empathy circles with each other and model it for the citizens, that could, be a good first step. And I've been working on Gavin Newsom to take part in one. So that's one of the projects I have.
How are you doing?
Well, I can tell you a little bit of the story of it. So I had run into Gavin Newsom at an event, when he was running for office. And I talked to him about empathy, and I said, "Oh, Gavin, would you do an empathy circle with John Cox, who was running on the Republican side? Would you do an empathy circle with John Cox?" And he said, "John Cox has no empathy." I said, "Well, what if John Cox would do an empathy circle? Would you do it with him?" He said, "He would never do an empathy circle." So
that's one you can work with, because if he does do it, there you are.
Exactly. Well, we're starting a relationship. We're starting a dialogue. Exactly. And then then I went and tried to connect with the John Cox campaign. I couldn't, kind of work up the hierarchy. But then we set up the empathy tent just before the election in Los Angeles at a political convention. And right across from us was a John Cox campaign. So I went over and talked to them and, made a personal connection. And it actually did move up the hierarchy where they said that he was willing to do an empathy circle. But it was just before the election, and it was like not enough time to, pull it together. And then, anyway, so I kind of gave up there. But then I went to the Republican State Convention in Sacramento, because I've been to the Republican and the Democrats. We're trying to bring the Republicans and Democrats together into these dialogues. And I ran into John Cox and talked to him personally. He gave me his personal phone number. And then I was at the Democratic convention. I ran into Gavin Newsom. He was walking the halls there with his security details. And I said, "Hey, would you remember me?" And he remembered I have my T-shirts. So I had it on both times. So he remembered me. And I said, "Would you do the empathy circle with John Cox?" And he didn't say anything. He said, "Oh, you're just going to ignore me." And he said, "Oh, I'm open to it. I'm open to it."
Well,
so I'm working. Yeah. So I'm kind of, I'm working towards it. My next step is to write up a proposal, to put on through their channel. And I've been thinking, if he will not do it, to maybe set up the empathy tent on the Capitol lawn and occupy it. And be willing to get arrested. So I'm saying, I want an empathy circle. Gavin Newsom sort of said he's open to it. He won't pay attention. Go ahead and arrest me. We're not leaving here until he takes part in an empathy circle with John Cox. So that's sort of the direction I'm going, is more of an assertive, political.
Civil disobedience.
Yeah, civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, but with the intention of bringing people into a conversation. So,
what I think that's exciting and kind of fun. The thing that occurred to me when you posed the question just now wasn't politicians, because I guess I'm enough of a cynic to think that there are powerful reasons why politicians choose not to be honest in their speech. And it shines out when there's an exception to that rule. Like Pete Buttigieg, for example, I think speaks more honestly than any politician I've heard. I'm not advocating a candidate, but I'm just saying there's somebody who's actually saying what he thinks, but it stands out because of it being so rare. Where my mind went is, I ask myself every time there's a new horror about a mass shooting, where the major religious leaders are in this country. And I would love to see high-profile empathy circles involving fundamentalist Christian right religious leaders and liberal religious leaders and mainstream centrist ones, talking about what their faith demands of them when this is what's happening in the streets.
Yeah, if you're interested in helping, line that up, if you know any of those people.
I'm not in those circles
Oh,
myself, but
mhm.
the reason why that sort of pulls me is that politicians are in such low repute nowadays that I don't think many people look to them for moral leadership. But there are a lot of people who still look to their religious leaders for moral leadership, and they're not. Where are they? You're not.
Yeah.
They're not. They're not getting interviewed in the Times. They're not. Their views are not coming forward. And if they did, I think that would have an impact on a lot of people. So a dialogue between a religious leader who's a Trump supporter and an NRA supporter and somebody who isn't, to me, would be very powerful.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're working on. So every week, every Saturday, we have empathy circles with the political left and right. So we've, had like topics like abortion, which are some of the more intense ones, and some of the, organizers for, pro-life groups. And so it's doing it online with Zoom is pretty easy to set up. It's quick, you don't have to go. And so we can bring those different groups together. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. That's what one of the main efforts right now is, doing these empathy circles, bringing these. I hadn't thought of the religious leaders, but I think that's a really good, to bring the the Trump supporter, the evangelicals with some liberal.
Right, and especially around gun control, because it's very difficult for me to understand how any person of any religious faith can be silent in the face of this. I understand the differences that exist around abortion, but I don't understand how a person with a deep faith could be silent about murdering in the streets, white terrorism, basically.
Yeah, in terms of the politicians, I do see that having politicians do empathy circles can sort of model this too, because they're kind of representatives of different groups. So
Yeah.
I think I still have hope for, that. And we did something called the Radical Empathy Forum at UC Berkeley, and we had 11 candidates who were running for the Assembly District take part. And when politicians are running for office, they're willing to try anything for attention.
Anything for publicity.
For publicity. So we had 11 candidates. We divided them into two groups, and we did an empathy circle with them. And some of them were actually pretty good. By having them take part in an empathy circle, you see a different side of them. You can see who's really good. You can really see who's really listening, who's able to, reflect back accurately what the other person has said, with a sense of depth and understanding. So it's a good insight to have. And so that was our first sort of, foray into working with the politicians. And there was a town hall with a congressman, and where I'm in Contra Costa, Mark DeSaulnier, and Barbara Lee. They were doing a town hall on race, and they took some questions, and the very last question was my question, which was, would the representatives be willing to take part in an empathy circle with Republicans on the topic of race? And in front of 250 people, they both said yes. So we've got a commitment, but getting them to actually do it is a whole nother thing, so it's
well, like, my sense is that would be an issue where you would have more traction, because suddenly this year, it seems almost, race is the issue on which everybody is acknowledging that they've got to be candid in a way that I haven't seen before. So good luck with that.
So anyway, but I think it all interrelates with what because the skills you're teaching for lawyers are the same exact skills for mediating these other conflicts, it seems. So all these tools and mindsets sort of interrelate culturally, because it's like, how do humans relate with each other, and how can we sort of spread this? I see it more of as a empathic core mindset is a term that I've used. I think it most accurately kind of touches on what we're doing. We're hearing each other, we're seeing each other's humanity in a sort of an integrative, relational process that's going on, instead of one side dominating the other. That we're sort of integrating our just our humanity.
Yeah, the thing that occurs to me is that you can see the conceptual framework of empathy as being the pre-conflict model, and restorative processes as the remedy for the failures of empathy.
Yeah, I guess I see even the restorative is restorative empathy.
Yes.
It's like we need to have a concept of what is our relationship. We want an empathic, caring, sensitive to each other's experience relationship from, just the common, just the normal relationship. And if there's a break in it, we want to restore that empathy. So even, with my family, who are some Trump supporters, my family, they live in the Central Valley. They're mostly, Republican conservatives, whereas I used to be sort of liberal, progressive. Now I'm empathic. So I'm leaving both sides to go to the empathic, party. But we do family empathy circles, and they really appreciate it. It's like, it really can bridge, and we start the circle off by saying we want to, build and maintain an empathic, caring, mutually supportive family. So we're doing this for what the reason is that we're doing it for, and then we use this as the sort of the practice for everyone feeling heard and seen and acknowledged. And we just had an empathy circle like last month. It went for 4.5 hours. We were just talking about some family issues. So, yeah.
No, I see the world and the challenge in terms that are very congruent with yours. My own, the way that I've myself been very comfortable conceptualizing the purpose and the means for my own work in this field. I find that I gravitate more toward terminology out of evolutionary biology, psychobiology, because it doesn't turn anybody off. So I tend to speak in terms of our evolutionary endowment, and that the reason we became the alpha species on the planet, for better and worse, is the capacity to cooperate and to engage in acts of altruism for the betterment of everybody. And that this requires a level of trust in the humanity of one another that can be restored and can be built. And empathy I see as the tool for it. I guess in my world, leading with the terminology of empathy could be problematic. An invitation that those who need it most might be reluctant to accept. But I think we're saying the same thing and using different words for it.
Yeah, people have an association with empathy that might turn them off, and you have to find vocabulary that sort of resonates with them and speaks to them, that they don't get like defensive or get turned off by it.
That intrigues them and draws them, rather than involving any needless reactivity.
Well, in my family, I had talked for quite a time about the empathy work that I was doing, and nobody understood it, sort of like what you're saying. And then a conflict started in the family where two family members were going at each other. And I started listening and empathizing with both parties. It was my mother and sister-in-law. And it was like on Christmas, and it looked like the whole Christmas was going to blow up. And I started, just doing empathic listening with both sides, listen to one, listen to the other. And then I asked them to start doing empathic listening with each other, which they did, and they struggled with it, and I kind of kept facilitating it. And then the whole family sort of started joining into this circle. And it ended with, sort of peeling the onion away and getting to the core issue, which was not even about the initial issue. It was like about who had a sense of belonging in the family. And it ended with hugs all around. And then I said, oh, by the way, this is empathy.
There you go. That's exactly what I do, is I find a way to offer a context that people will want to join into, where experiences happen that are what we're working toward, without having to say, please come and do this thing called whatever, empathy or deep communication. The experience precedes the labeling.
Right.
Yeah.
And then people associate, they create those neurological associations. Oh, this experience means this. And then it's easier to, so it is a bit of I see that. But I guess I don't want to, for me, I don't want to abandon the empathy terms. I think it's the most accurate term for what it is that, we're trying to create.
I think that's true. I think biologically speaking, that is the phenomenon that enables reconnecting. So yeah, I agree with you.
And so I sort of want to defend the term and sort of build on it. And, being in the legal profession, you probably were aware of how Barack Obama, he said that he would choose a Supreme Court justice that had empathy as one of the qualities. And it's like all hell broke loose with the...
Where that went. And when Sonia Sotomayor talked about different perspectives and life experiences as a woman and a Hispanic woman, what she was talking about was bringing a capacity for empathy that, if you think about Venn diagrams, what she's bringing is slightly different than the old white guy next to her. Again, all hell broke loose because lawyers want to think that the law is above that in some fashion, or separate from that, that somehow humanity isn't what the law is about. And that's a very destructive concept.
Yeah, there was I don't know if you tracked it, but the Senate talked about empathy. There's it was like Jeff Sessions was railing against empathy, and the Democrats did almost nothing in terms of defending the term. The Democrats did not know actually what they were sort of defending. They couldn't articulate it, and they were confusing it with sympathy, and it was just a big muddle, and it was just
soft stuff that doesn't have firm boundaries and values. And the Democrats circle the wagons and shoot inward.
Yeah, it was a bit of a disaster. So that was sort of a cultural shift with Barack Obama's attempt.
Well, it didn't succeed, though, and I think it's, this question of terminology is really what we're talking about. It's not something to be debated, it's just something to be aware of in terms of who one's talking to and what the best way is, I think, to invite.
Yeah.
You did it through the conflict itself with your family, which I think is powerful. That's how we do it in collaborative practice. The need to resolve the conflict is so powerful that we can bring in every tool we've got without having to name it or say, how about if we try X or Y? We just do it. And the experience of where that takes people has its own power.
Yeah, I'm looking at that. How do we do it at this macro political level? Because it seems that we can sort of crack that nut, shift something there. It's going to flow throughout the society too. You can sort of build up like you're doing. You can kind of build up from the grassroots, but also to shift sort of at that political level.
Well, actually, I tend more toward the macro level myself. It's the macro level within the legal profession, but I really like to go for the leadership, and I like to go for the big picture. It ends up having impact one-on-one, because that's the only way that anything has impact. but I'm trying to change a macro cultural conversation about what law is for in human culture. And I don't think that it's for war.
For war?
I don't think it's for war. I think the law, like everything else in our culture, is in a long evolutionary arc. And change is now happening. I can see it in a lot of places where I wouldn't have thought it possible when I graduated from law school. For example, at that time, when I came out of law school, I thought the ABA was my enemy. That's where I was going to go out and cross swords and make change happen. And it turned out that one of the huge doors that opened in my movement building work with the collaborative practice movement was the American Bar Association. They were shifting and changing, and they created something that they named the Lawyer as Problem Solver Award. And Stu Webb, the guy from Minnesota, and I shared the first one. That gave me a credibility and a gravitas to speak to the people that I needed to speak to. That I don't think my trajectory of my work could have been as strong as it's been without that institutional shift that was also happening without me being aware of it. So
there are these shifts within the society. These of the cultural institutions are sort of making shifts too.
And the ABA, which is the voice of the American legal profession, is now looking at vicarious trauma, is emphasizing for young lawyers self-care. I never thought I'd see the day. And those are all ways of creating a sense that the work we do is the work of human reconnection.
That's the core.
And that it begins with oneself.
Yeah.
The Fetzer Institute, I don't know if you know about them.
Sure.
You know who they are.
Yeah.
They funded a conference for the collaborative practice movement that they called "What's Love Got to Do with It?" It was about the family courts and trying to create constructive change in the family law system. And for me, it was a very potent conference, and a lot of good stuff came out of it. For me, what came out of it was an article called "Talking About Love with Lawyers." And the title itself encapsulated the problem, which is you try to talk about love with lawyers and you've got an empty room. And the ending of when I write something like that, I have no idea what I'm going to say until it's finished. I don't even know what I'm going to say. But where it ended up was about love and forgiveness. That forgiveness is kind of the enactment of love in the family systems conflict work that we do. And that where forgiveness has to begin for lawyers who do this work is forgiving themselves for the work that they've done, being told that that was what they were supposed to do.
It's painful. Yeah, they have a lot of pent up,
empathy for oneself.
Right, self-empathy. And to be heard about your own pain. They need that empathic support from others too, to just hear. I mean, it's probably just huge grief, like, oh, wow, I created all this disconnection and harm to other people. And I realized that, it must be devastating with your career.
I mentioned earlier on about men in three-piece suits weeping. That's what it's about, is that there's a sudden flash of like macro awareness of your place in a destructive system that nobody intended to work that way. And all you can do is weep.
Yeah.
But that's a terrifically powerful moment. And I never know whether or who or how, but the work I do is to try to precipitate that.
Well, my sense is, we talked about Jeff Sessions, that if Jeff Sessions and the Republicans had really understood what we're talking about by empathy, I think they would be very supportive. It's a very subtle sort of a mindset. And they're concerned that, oh, you're talking about is sympathy for the down and out, and it's going to be at my expense.
Right.
And there was nobody explaining it's really empathy between all participants. It's a culture of empathy. It's like, all the participants have empathy for each other, and it's through this empathic dialogue that we work through the conflict and find some resolution and new creative steps forward. And there was nobody to articulate that. There was nobody in the Senate to kind of explain it. They could have had the Democrats could have said, okay, empathy is a big issue. Let's have an empathy hearing, right? We're going to bring in the experts and we have a whole societal dialogue on what do we mean by empathy, and really have explored and articulated like what we're really talking about. And I think that I feel pretty, from my experience of dealing with the left and right, if people really understand what we're talking about, without all these preconceived notions and misunderstandings, they're very supportive because it feels so good to be heard and understood. And people get that, it's like they get it.
Maybe you could have a sub-project that experiments with speaking to people with different terminology, just to bring it in. Because I think that what you're describing is a terminological problem. And what you're seeing is what I see when the invitation is couched in words that carry their own problems, however much I like them.
Well, I'm putting it into a structure that the empathy circle is the experiential structure of it. So I try to bring people into the empathy circle as the experience. So I've been, really, developing this and creating training materials and see how do we is this first step, just experience the empathy circle. And this is the meaning of what we're talking about. So that's why I had wanted to invite you to an empathy circle, and, trying to get politicians to take part too, where we do empathy circle being, one person speaks, they select who they're going to speak to. That person reflects back their understanding to the satisfaction of the speaker of what they're saying. And then once the speaker feels heard, the listener selects someone to speak to, and that person reflects back until this, and you keep going around like that. And it ends in hugs, at least between the Republicans and the Democrats. And it's just like how to sort of spread this is kind of what I'm kind of looking at.
It's what therapists and collaborative people call looping. And it's a powerful tool that's used in a lot of contexts. What I'm hearing you say is that politicians that you want to bring into this are not necessarily responding positively unless they're running for office and need the publicity. And so you might experiment with describing the experience rather than beginning with the label.
Mm-hmm.
Just
try that. Well, I hope we can continue the discussion and do some empathy circles, and if you want to, then we sort of model the practice, and just by viewing the practice, people observe it, and they can sort of absorb it just by observing, and maybe even get some religious leaders.
I would love to see that. I would love to try to find a way to understand how the fundamentalist and evangelical religious base of the right experiences their religious values in that world. I really would like to understand that.
Well, who would be the participants that you would like to see?
Well, as I say, I am by no means expert in those domains. I keep my distance, but every time I read the newspapers, what I look for is, where are they?
Mm-hmm.
Why am I not hearing how their faith relates to the horrors that we're seeing?
Yeah. Well, we have this actually, our empathy circle this Saturday is on that topic of, how do you feel about the gun violence and mass shootings? So we're going to start on it and do some on that topic. So So yeah, well, let's. Thanks for the discussion. You know, it's really
Thank
we're
you.
totally allies. We're just along the same path of creating this more connecting society. And there's so many different parts of society moving towards this, and it's great to connect and hear what other people are doing and see how we can collaborate to really make this cultural shift too.
Yeah, I'm delighted to know about your work. I reached out because it just seemed intriguing, and people who I know in my world have connected with you. So I am really pleased to know about what you're up to, and I'd love to stay connected. And as I say, if you have any interest in talking with the Commonweal director,
Definitely, yeah. If you want to arrange that, if you can make an introduction or something, because I'm not set up as a nonprofit, and my partner keeps saying, "Oh, you got to be a nonprofit," and aligning with a group like that could be a good, good step.
Yeah, I think if you just describe a couple of the things you've done lately, like just having your 3-camera setup in LA and what the consequences of that were, and your intention of bringing the empathy tent to Sacramento. I will introduce you. His name is Oren, and I will do an email introduction and talk with him about your work and about fiscal agency. And I think you'll find some common ground there.
Yeah, and now it's getting me thinking of other things. It's not only Sacramento, but the Capitol Mall. I say we set up an occupation of the Capitol Mall. We say we're not leaving until all the Democrats and Republicans have empathy circles with each other on the gun violence topic or whatever topic.
Yeah.
Let's go for the jugular.
I will put you in touch with Oren.
Okay.
And it's good to talk with you.
Very good. Thank you.
Take care.
Pauline, bye.
Bye.